This week we're going to look at production and trade, and we're going to begin with the production possibility frontier. Now, most countries produce multiple goods, but we're going to look at it as a two-good model. In this case, I've said either private goods or public goods, because a factory can produce one thing or another. But oftentimes it was referred to as guns and versus butter, with the idea that butter is what we consume domestically, and guns are something that we produce for the military to do other things, not necessarily to consume. Now, the production possibility frontier assumes that you're at full employment. Full employment is the country's producing as much as it possibly could, or 24 hours in a day factories. If you're at less than full employment, obviously you're producing less than your frontier being the outer boundary of what you can produce. Now, more typically, we'll look at it as a factory rather than, United States and Mexico, they can produce either shoes or refrigerators. What you'll notice in this example from the text book is that the U.S. has an absolute advantage over Mexico in both cases. They can produce 10,000 shoes and Mexico only 8, or they can produce 40,000 refrigerators and Mexico only 10,000. That means that the United States is more productive than. However, comparatively speaking, the Mexicans are almost as efficient as the United States when producing shoes. So that's by comparison, they're more efficient in the trade-off producing shoes than they are producing refrigerators. The U.S. has a 4-to-1 ratio on refrigerators, but only a little bit over a 1-to-1 ratio on shoes. Now, Adam Smith talks about the concept of specialization in The Wealth of Nations, his book written in 1776. It's a very famous example about pin makers, and how if each pin maker was to start making a pin, which was something that you did cutting from a bunch of wire and straighten it out and putting a head on it and so on, then you could maybe produce 20 in a day from each worker. So 10 men could produce about 200. And he explains that if you take that process of making a pin and break it into about 18 different tasks, one man draws out the wire, another straightens it, a third cuts it, a fourth points it, a fifth grinds it at the top, and so on, then everybody doing just their one little task, those 10 persons could make upwards of 48,000 pins in a day. So instead of a couple of hundred pins, because each person is doing all the parts of the job, specialization allows improvements in production. So back to the United States and Mexico, where we initially had 9,000 shoes and 25,000 refrigerators. If you have Mexicans produce more shoes and the U.S. trades off and produces more refrigerators, you can have a total gain of 9,500 shoes and 28,500 refrigerators in this example. Now we'll look at it a little bit more simplistically here, the United States versus France. And again, cheese and wine are the two things they're going to consume. So in the U.S., in a 24-hour period, can produce 16 pounds of cheese and 4 gallons of wine, because they take 1 hour for a cheese and 2 hours for wine. France is less efficient, 6 hours for cheese and 3 hours for wine. But as you can see, 6 hours compared to U.S. 1 hour. Cheese, they're far less efficient. Wine, they take longer than the U.S., but it's 3 hours versus 2. So that's where they're going to specialize. So if France produces 24 hours of wine and the U.S. 24 hours of cheese, our total production is 24 pounds of cheese and 8 gallons of wine, where previously it had been 19 cheese and 6 wine. So world production increases when you specialize. One nation produces. It may not be an absolute advantage, but it is a comparative advantage. So when talking about this concept of absolute and comparative advantage, David Ricardo mentions in his book on the principles of political economy and taxation in 1817, that's where the concept of absolute advantage and comparative advantage was first discussed. Now, in a more simplistic country where they produce both oil and corn, what you're having here is just sell a little bit of oil, produce and buy some extra corn, and you notice that pushes the point D is outside the line that goes from A to B, the A to B being the production possibility frontier, and by selling some and buying others, you can push yourself past that limit. So that's the goal of trade. Now, in a world environment, if the free trade or the world price is higher than what you would get domestically from your country, then obviously you're going to want to trade. And what you're going to do is produce and export some of that stuff. And if you can get a higher price from another country, obviously that's going to drive up the price locally, because your goal as a producer is to get the most money, so you would sooner export it to another country than you would sell it at a cheaper price locally. Now, the flip side is if the world price is lower than the current price domestically, then obviously you're not going to produce so much, and the consumers are going to import a lot of stuff. So that's what happens when the world price is cheaper than your current domestic price. And the last thing I want to just talk about is tariffs. They're just government taxes that are placed on imported goods. They're not usually for very good reasons. They're not for economic reasons. Mostly it's a political reason, often to protect a vested interest, like could be a political campaign, contributors, and so on. But they usually claim to have a valid reason, but tariffs really are just an interruption in trade.